Welcome, everyone, to the Global Engagement Insights podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we've got a very special guest. We've got Paulo Zagalo-Melo. And Paulo is the Associate Provost for Global Education at Western Michigan University. Now, Paulo, you've got an interesting background. You've been in global education for over 30 years. You also are in a rock band, and you play drums and bass, and it's great, right? Because you've got a lot of diverse interests. But today we're going to be talking specifically about internationalization and how it's just a no-brainer for higher education institutions, all the way from why is it a no-brainer? What's the case for that? You've got some really interesting stats. But we're also going to talk about then how do you get funds and resources in that strategic budgeting process to make sure that you have those resources in order to be able to fund and then execute well on the programs. But maybe take just a minute beyond the small introduction I made for you there and tell us a little bit more about your background and what you're doing right now at Western Michigan.
Okay, thank you. So at Western Michigan, as you mentioned, I'm the Associate Provost for Global Education, which means that I'm in charge of the international office here at Western Michigan University. Our international office is actually called the Haneke Institute for Global Education. And my role is to design strategy and implement strategy and projects and programs, initiatives in internationalization for Western Michigan University. As you mentioned, I've worked in this field for 30 years now. I just realized that this fall, when I actually completed 3 decades working in this area. I worked for Fulbright. That's how I stumbled upon the world of internationalization, to take a job as a financial officer for the Fulbright Commission in Portugal 30 years ago, because my background is in accounting and finance and management. So I took a job as a financial officer for this organization I knew absolutely nothing about, to be very honest, back then. I knew it was connected with the US and the US government, Department of State, the embassy, the Portuguese government as well. But I have no idea what I was getting myself into. And definitely I had no idea that it was going to be the job that changed my life and my career.
And tell me just a little bit about that, because I know you're very passionate about internationalization and what it does for students. And you were a international student as well, isn't that right?
I was twice for my master's, an international student from Portugal here to the US, and then again during my doctorate. It was a great experience. I can honestly say that I've looked at internationalization from all possible angles.
It's great because we're going to rely on that passion and all those angles specifically today. But I want to start out from a big picture. And if I were just to ask you a question and ask you to give us a rating from 1 to 10 on how important is international education on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 for the institution, it's not important at all. 10, it's actually vital to the overall growth and sustainability of higher education today. Where would you put it on that scale and why?
I put it at the highest quarter of the scale, to be honest. It's really essential for many reasons. It's essential financially because it helps with international enrollment, helps with growth, with the financial sustainability of the organization. It opens the door to an enrollment market that is growing. And so that part is obviously meaningful in the financial side, but it's also more than that. It's the global search for talent. And that, I think, is a very important part. And ultimately, and this is, I think, why so many people working in this field are so passionate about it. Ultimately, we're contributing to changing the mindset at the institutional level, at the local community level, at the state level, country level, and in the world. We contribute to mutual understanding. That's what international education does ultimately, is contributing to mutual understanding between peoples of different cultures, different languages, different traditions. And so I usually say that we're in the peacekeeping business, the peacekeeping industry. We contribute to people to understand each other better so that when in moments of conflict, that mutual understanding can contribute to a better mediation or resolution of that conflict. And I think that's ultimately what really drives people who work in internationalization to go to their office every day with a spring in their step and thinking that they're doing something so much bigger than themselves or their institutions.
I want to understand a bit more about that. But you have such an interesting background and a financial background as well in global education. What is the overall economic value? If you were assessing global student enrollment growth and the impact on the higher education institution, how do you, from a financial perspective, how do you explain that kind of an impact so that we can understand it?
It is an impact that goes beyond what most people imagine. And so it's really from a financial type of contribution. I can tell you that, for instance, just the case of Western Michigan University. And we're talking about a university with about 15,000 students. So it's a mid-sized public university in a city of Kalamazoo of about 80,000 people, Kalamazoo County, about 200,000 people. The international enrollment at Western contributes with over $70 million to the community.
Wow.
And it contributes to about 600 jobs in the community. And these are not Paulo's numbers. This is not my educated guess or anything like that. These are actually numbers published by NAFSA, the Association of International Educators. And the numbers they publish are actually based on data provided by the US Department of Commerce.
And I've heard that global education is responsible in the whole US, let alone the world, but the US for $38 billion of economic impact.
Exactly. The impact is really just the example I gave of such a small community. If you consider the size of the United States, and we're talking about immediately $70 million in a city of 80,000 people, just from one university. And so it's really, the size is really impactful. It's a top 5 export for the US. At its peak, was a top 5 export for the US. So this is, in terms of the US economic activity, this is by any means a very meaningful impact. And again, it's just goes so much beyond the financial and economic side of things. So while you're contributing to the US economy, in the case of US higher education, you're also contributing to improving the quality of research and innovation in the US and in every country that has international enrollment, because research topics know no boundaries. One could argue that there's no local. To be honest, I don't even know if there was ever local in the history of civilization. We've had that search for global talent since the beginning of civilization. I always remember two great examples. Cicero, the Roman philosopher, went to Athens in Greece to improve his skills in rhetoric, because obviously in Athens there were great philosophers, experts considered at the time and still today, experts in rhetoric. And so we had this Roman philosopher went to Greece to improve his skills on rhetoric. That's a good example of how far back you have examples of people wanting to improve their skills through international education and an international scholarly work. And another example I give, for instance, in the case of the search for global talent, Christopher Columbus was born in Italy. He moved to Portugal at age 25 because Portugal was a naval power, was the main naval power at the time. And then ended up moving to Spain because Portugal had already too many projects, too many trips, journeys going on in maritime expansion, and goes to Spain, and the crown of Spain ends up funding his journey to the Americas. And so we have someone who is born in Italy, moves to another country for to be where the global talent for his particular activity was, and then moves on to search for where the investment for that activity was. We can find so many examples going far back as many centuries or millennia we want. This is something that it's part of the human condition. Internationalization of education, of higher education, of any sort of education, cultural exchanges, they're part of the human condition. There were never borders that stopped this, and I truly hope that there will never be.
That's amazing. Did not know that about Christopher Columbus. Thank you for that. So it's a part of our global culture in how we've always operated. Tell me a little bit about the white elephant in the room, which is the enrollment cliff, the declining enrollments, and what is the impact of global education for higher education institutions as the trend is going in the wrong direction?
The impact for higher education can be significant. And we're not only talking about the financial impact, but we can think, for instance, of the economic competitiveness of a country that for some reason closes its institutions, or institutions themselves close to internationalization, to cultural exchanges. As I mentioned, no research topic knows borders. And so the fact that if you close that interaction, that intellectual exchange, you will have limitations to what you could achieve in terms of innovation, creativity. The best ideas about what you're doing might be somewhere else, or someone else in another country might have ideas or ways of thinking, methodologies that can really make a groundbreaking difference in what we do in a certain area of research or a certain area of our economy. And so closing ourselves to that cultural, intellectual exchange is really drawing a limit to what should have no limits. And the technologies we have nowadays, the types of research we do, we can see how far we've gone in terms of just a few decades of what we thought was impossible to achieve and where we are now. And with things like artificial intelligence, when 30 years ago, when I started working in international education, we barely had computers.
Right.
We had personal computers, at least. All this increase, this growth, this expansion of thought and ideas and creativity, and the economic impact that comes with it is really the result of an open borders policy on connecting the minds of people around the world.
So the impact is, what you're saying, limitless here. You had mentioned in a previous conversation that international education represented the largest growth market. So now we're talking about the business of staying in business of higher education. In order to be able to fund and create and perpetuate everything that you're talking about here, which goes to the very nature of our, as a country in the US and other countries, our competitive advantage, but just as we progress as a global society in the research and the breakthroughs and the things that we're doing. What did you mean by international education was the number one growth market for higher education?
Exactly. For instance, in 2022, there were 6.4 million students studying outside of their home countries.
Mhm.
So the global international enrollment was of over 6 million. And that represents a growth over the last decade. If we don't consider the pandemic years, if we go only within the decade of 2010 until 2020, global international enrollment grew by 70%, 70% in a decade.
Wow.
I'd love to see what other economic areas of activity grew by similar percentages within just one decade. The number of international students in the US grew exponentially. If we look at the 1950s, when really cultural exchanges, student exchanges, international enrollment really started taking off institutionally with programs like the Fulbright program that was created in 1946. If we look at the growth, since I really don't think there are many areas of economic activity that have that kind of growth in such a short time. Of course, that it's not a short time since the 1950s, but it is if you consider the type of growth that this activity has had, not only in the US, but more recently, everywhere around the world. From 2000 to 2022, the number grew by 4 times. Number of international students everywhere. It's really unbelievable. But again, if we look at the history of humankind, it has always been there. And of course, that if it was so difficult to travel back then, I can imagine what it was for a philosopher like Cicero just to go from Rome to Athens back in 79 BC compared to what it would take now for any of us to go from, takes me, for instance, to go from Chicago to Athens to Greece if I wanted to, or to from Detroit to Greece. It shouldn't be a surprise, but I think the numbers that make it more impactful are not only the numbers, not only the levels of economic impact, but also how diversity, all types of diversity, racial, ethnic, intellectual, cultural diversity has increased in our campuses. And that's also very important because we have to acknowledge that there are students who will never leave their home, their hometown, or their home state, or their home country. But they can have everywhere around the world in institutions that are truly internationalized. They can have a global education and an exposure to a representation of the world, a real representation of world cultures that happens at their doorstep. And I think that's really important because no matter where they are and where they will be for their entire life, if they never leave their home state, for instance, or their city, the world is still there. The fact that they work in and move and socialize in a globally interconnected world doesn't stop at the door of someone who has never left their city. They still have to deal with that global dimension in everything they do.
Our last conversation that we had, you brought up diversity, and I looked it up. And actually, diversity is a very important point for students in deciding where they're going to go. After the cost of tuition, after the degrees that are being offered and the location, it's diversity. So it's not only something that betters us as individuals, but it's actually, as we're trying to address enrollment issues in decline, it is, after the top big 3, it is the number one decision-making factor for students today. So what I'm hearing from you is that not only is there this global market to help address the decline in enrollments that is going up dramatically as enrollments overall are going down, but it's also diversity in culture and the sharing of ideas and research and economic impact. There is just a collection that leads me to my next question for you, which is, if you're giving advice to other SIOs and you're giving advice to others that are creating and maintaining the mission and the strategic plan for higher education, what is your advice to them in terms of the importance of global engagement in what they're doing?
How to make the case? You mean how to make the case within their own institutions? That's our daily life for all SIOs, I'd say. No matter how supportive the institution is, it's something that we must do almost on a daily basis. I think it's important to connect what we do with the mission and the vision of the university, and to show that in every dimension, every component of the university's vision and the university's mission, there is the need for global. There's the need for global education, there is the need for global research. There is the need for the search of global talent to come to our institutions. There's the need to send our students abroad or develop global competence, even if they don't go abroad, because they need that global competence to be the best version of themselves in our interconnected world. So I think it's very important to make the case by aligning what we do, not as an add-on. We're not an auxiliary service of the university. We're not something that is one of the departments of the university. We do business over here. We do engineering over there. And then we do international also in another place. International is embedded within everything that the institution does. And that's how you make the case, is to show that you can do this better with a global component and an international component. You need to have an international component in research. You need to have a global education component in business and in engineering and in most areas. So it's by really demonstrating how infused internationalization is in the life of the institution. I really never like to see internationalization referred as something that the university does or has as a department, as an office, or as one of the components of what the university does, because it's in everything. It should be in everything. So I usually say I don't mind if the institution doesn't highlight internationalization, as long as internationalization is in everything we do.
You said something at the very beginning of this. You said that it's something that you have to constantly do, right? So when we talk ultimately here about garnering resources and strategic budgeting, you're talking about being a constant advocate in making the case of how it infuses into everything that the university does, making the case that it actually represents one of the largest global markets for increasing enrollments. You're making the case on a constant basis, where I know you're also looking for your own champions internally. But what I'm hearing you say is we need to be the champions for how we're helping the institution. And that's how we're going to garner our support internally. Is that a good representation of what you're saying?
That's the perfect representation. Yes. We have to internally show that we are everywhere, that what we do impacts most, if not everything, that the university is doing or could impact if embedded into those activities and those programs and so forth. That's really how you make the case, is to show that we're just delivering something that is essential to everything we do.
How does that process work well? And then what are the lessons that you've learned for doing this for 30 years and putting together those budgets and pitching and constantly being that advocate? What's the advice that you could give folks that are constantly trying to do that themselves, that maybe don't have the same mission that Western Michigan University does, that need some advice and some help in that area?
I think that might be where strategic budgeting comes in, and which has been something that I've also been pushing for as a label in international, as in a focus in international education and internationalization. There are two metaphors that I tend to use. One is that first, sometimes you have to live with the fact that you must show that the plane flies, that the airplane flies. You must show that you can take it off the ground, even if it's not fully finished, so that people see it works and you get their attention. It reminds me of when you see those images of the first airplanes, the first version of, they don't even look like airplanes, some of them, that the pioneers of aviation were trying to show the world that they could make these contraptions that, that flew. We have to do sometimes the same thing. We have to show that this works, this global learning program, this COIL program. You have to sometimes set up initiatives that are not perfect to start with, but they show the potential. So I think that's always very important. It's even, you can't wait for everything to be okay and almost perfect for you to design the wonderful study abroad program and the wonderful global learning program and so forth. And to have you have to do things first to show, okay, we can make this work. And then you also have to show that you can do it in a financially sustainable manner.
Mhm.
So the second stage of showing that the plane flies is, okay, now you go on to build something that is financially sustainable. No sinking ship will reach its journey. And so you have to show that you might have a good idea, you might have a great program, but more than that, that this can work consistently. And it's not a one-off thing that you could make it work for one day or 1 month or 1 year, but then it disappears into thin air because you've never thought about how to sustain that. So the second stage is really build something that is financially sustainable by budgeting correctly, by being able to have a comprehensive budgeting strategy, and also to align your budgeting with the strategy of the university. And that's another important part of what strategic budgeting is, that you have to connect the strategy of the university, the strategic plan of the university to what you're doing. Or I should say, connect what you're doing to the strategic planning of the university to show again, because at that point, you're again making the case for internationalization. You're saying, here are all these programs and initiatives that are perfectly aligned with all these strategies in the institution's strategic plan. And here are they correctly budgeted, so we can show that they will be financially sustainable and can last for the next 5 years, 10 years, endlessly. And so that's really the importance of strategic budgeting. It's really the essence of making the case for international education. It's important to make the case for international education through a strategic budgeting approach.
And what are the most important proof points on the sustainability that what you're doing? Yes, you can get it up, it can fly, but guess what? We can keep it in the air, right? And it's going to fit into the overall mission. But what are the proof points that it's sustainable, that it's something that's going to last?
You have to, just like in any other business initiative or economic initiative, you have to show that numbers supporting there's a market, there's demand,
Mm.
that there's demand, that there's a need. And in global education, again, the need goes to, or in global engagement, the need is about international interactions to support our research, global learning programs to increase global competence of students, including those who might never leave their home country.
Mhm.
It's to show that competence, that what you're doing in terms of demand is important, that there's a demand for it, there's a need for it. And so once you show that there's a demand and there's a need for it institutionally, then you should show that it has a cost, that you know what the cost is. You've assessed all dimensions of the cost, and you also know what the institution needs to fund it on a sustainable way.
That sounds like a good, solid business plan.
You always need a good business plan.
I understand. But I think it's very important because the viability, what you're going to do, the sustainability, viability of it, but then also how it, I think that they all have to come together. That third point of how it fits into the overall mission of the university itself is really important. What, in terms of global education and strategic budgeting, what haven't we talked about yet? What's something that we haven't covered that's important if we're helping to educate others that are trying to perpetuate their offices in other institutions?
That's a very important question. There's a major challenge about all this. it's making the case politically. And I don't mean politically in terms of the country's politics, any country's politics. It's more when you bring in the global aspect, and for instance, the importance of international enrollment, you tend to think, and that's the human condition. We like to protect our turfs. We sometimes feel that if people come into where we live, they might be taking something away from us, or they might be reducing the resources available to us, and so forth. That's human nature. And so it often happens that when an institution is trying to make the case, for instance, to invest more in international research or international connections towards innovation, or on investing more on international student recruitment to increase its international enrollment, for instance, it's easy for some people to think that there is money that we're not investing in the community where the institution is located.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the main issues with making the case often. And I think what is needed then is really to counter that argument is to show that the benefit, the return on investment of this international education or internationalization initiatives, the return on investment is more beneficial to the community than not investing in it. So the return on investment is higher than it is if the institution does not invest that money globally or internationally. I think that's what sometimes is lacking, because it is very easy to make the case that resources that are spent on international across borders outside of the country might not return to the country, might not return to the institution and to the institution's community. But they do. And in fact, those reports I mentioned earlier, just about any talk I give on international education, are based on the amazing work that NAFSA does, but also based on a lot of information from the Institute of International Education and, as I mentioned, the US Department of Commerce. They show the gain from, for instance, just international enrollment. Those reports are just about economic impact or economic value of international students in the US. That's really the scope of the report. And so those reports can be used to show that, at least in terms of economic value, it's always easier because it's basically numbers, to show that the economic value is there, and that the return on investment of having more international students at a certain institution reverts into the community and stays with the community. Now, there's the non-economic impact that might be more difficult, but if we look at the list of all the Nobel Prize winners residing and working in the US of the last 30, 40 years, let's see how many of them actually were international students or international scholars who came to the US and then stayed and resided in the US and got the Nobel Prize while working here. But I have actually a local story to Western Michigan University and to Michigan. For instance, just recently, we had our College of Engineering and Applied Sciences develop a project in partnership with the Michigan Department of Transportation. And the project was to rebuild a bridge in Detroit. And this was the first bridge, the first arch bridge in the world that was completed off-site, and then after completed, moved into place to where it finally will deliver its service. So these were faculty, obviously, faculty from Western Michigan University, from our College of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and students as well, many students participating. Most of the faculty and most of the students participating in this project were international students. Most of the faculty were originally from outside the US, and even if some of them or several of them are now US citizens, and most of the students participating in the project were international students here at Western. This is now a bridge that is going to be used every day for, I can imagine, thousands, if not tens of thousands of vehicles going over the bridge every day, every month. every year. And a very simple example of how that global talent and those international connections are essential to something as simple and present in our everyday life as crossing a bridge. And crossing a bridge that is innovative in terms of the way it was designed and built. So just a simple example of here in our state of Michigan, the the actual impact of international students, for instance.
With just the name international gives a perception that resources may not be staying, right? And there is a big perception versus reality. And you've done such a great job from financial to telling that story to the impact on the lives of the students themselves, because I'm sure there is not a lack of initiatives that are worthy of funding inside of higher education, right? So there is competition internally for a number of good ideas. And so making the case that you've talked about in all the different ways that you've talked about is so important in order to rise above that competition internally, right? In order to get the budgets and therefore then be able to execute on the plans that you talked about. If you had one thing, because we've talked about so much here, just a takeaway that you wanted to give to everyone who was listening or watching this, what would that takeaway be?
I think the takeaway definitely should be internationalization of higher education is essential, is foundational to higher education. It's not something new. Didn't start 10 years ago, 30 years ago. It was always there. It was always present in education, in academic life, as far back as you can take it. And ultimately, the reason why we do this is to contribute to a more peaceful world, to contribute to people understanding, different people from different cultures, different countries understanding each other better. And while doing that, we're contributing directly to improving our lives and the lives of our communities. No single topic is local anymore. If we're studying, I don't know, water problems in Kalamazoo or Michigan, for instance, a state that has such a large area of fresh water with the Great Lakes around the state, if we're studying fresh water and the importance of fresh water, there are communities everywhere dealing with those problems. And we can help them, and they can help us. And maybe we have problems for which they have found solutions that could be adapted, and we don't know. So it's about that we can only improve our lives through global education and global engagement. That's ultimately what to do. And while doing that, we're contributing to a better world and to people to understand each other. And we're economically benefiting our own communities and our own institutions and opening up the doors also for our communities to have more access to the world. And by more access to know more about the world, to interact better with the world, and even to look for opportunities elsewhere.
I know that people are going to have questions after watching this. If somebody wanted to reach out to you, would it be appropriate to give a link to your profile on LinkedIn as an example of how people can get a hold of you?
Of course, I'd be delighted. Yes, absolutely.
Paulo, thank you so much for coming on and sharing. Obviously, after 30 years, you've gained a lot of knowledge and wisdom on this. And I love the softer side. I'm calling it the softer side, but the strategies that you have to really think about beyond just pure finances, whether it's politics, the competition for good initiatives to fund internally, the dramatizing of how much impact it has locally and globally, and how important this is dating back to the very, very foundations of education. I think you've made a very good point in terms of making the case is important to strategic budgeting. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think strategic budgeting and making the case they're connected. They have to live connected. I really appreciate it. Thank you.